Saddleworth Moor in the northwest of England, separating the counties of Lancashire and Yorkshire, will forever be associated with the vile crimes of Ian Brady and Myra Hindley in the 1960s, when they were named by the press as the Moors murderers. That same title was also used less than 20 years earlier, shortly after the end of World War II, when those barren moors were used to conceal two bodies after a brutal and callous murder. The somewhat grandly named Manor House Farm at Standege Pass on the main A62 road linking Oldham in Lancashire and Huddersfield in Yorkshire stood almost on the border of the two counties, offering picturesque views of the desolate Saddleworth Moors. Percy and Alice Baker, both in their early 40s, disappeared suddenly in the late spring of 1947. They had a weekly routine that saw them enjoy Sunday lunch with friends Mr and Mrs Leonard Doherty. Indeed, such was this routine that if the Dohertys hadn't called at Manor House Farm by 2 p.m, then the Bakers would walk the 2 miles down the road and lunch with their friends across the border at their home in Dobb Cross. This routine had been broken on Sunday the 25th of May when the Bakers failed to show for lunch. On the following day, Mrs Baker also failed to turn up for a meeting with her friend Mrs Buckley, and a few days later Mrs Buckley decided to call on her friends to check all was well. She walked the short distance to the farmhouse and was more than a little surprised to see a furniture van outside the front gate. The crest on the van bore the name Gold, Lee & Co. with an address in Oldham. As Mrs Buckley approached the front door, 2 men came out of the house carrying a sofa. Asked if her friend was replacing her suite, the older of the 2 men put down the heavy settee and after wiping his brow replied, "No, they're moving." Clearly taken aback, Mrs Buckley told the man that her friend hadn't mentioned anything about moving, to which he just shrugged his shoulders and picked up the sofa. Mrs Buckley looked inside the hallway and saw it had been emptied. "This is incredible," she said, standing in the gateway, blocking the men's path to the van. "They've only been here since September, and only a short time ago they were both saying how much they like living here." "Look, they've split up," he told her as Mrs Buckley looked on bewildered. The man pointed to a note left in the porch, cancelling the various tradesmen and leaving some small change to settle up their accounts. "I don't believe this," she continued. "That's what they told me. He came into my shop last Thursday and said he and his wife had separated, that he wanted to sell the furniture. He was going back to join the RAF. I've got the signed agreement from Mr Baker at my office." As the removal men went about their tasks, Mrs Buckley returned home and contacted her husband at work. He agreed it sounded suspicious and said he would speak to the Dohertys, who he knew had arranged to have lunch with them on the previous Sunday. "Leonard Doherty knows the Bakers better than us. He'll know what's going on," he said. When Buckley phoned Doherty that evening, he was shocked to learn that the Bakers had failed to show on Sunday and they had not heard anything since. Deciding that this needed looking into further, on the following day, Ernest Buckley and Leonard Doherty went to the offices of Gold, Lee & Co. in Oldham and spoke to the proprietor, Philip Libman. Libman was one of the men Mrs Buckley had seen emptying the house on the previous day. He showed the 2 men the receipt signed by Mr Baker, and at once Doherty spoke up. "I've known Percy Baker for 20 years and I can assure you that is not his signature." Asked to describe the man who had signed the agreement, Libman said that he was a young man in his 20s with a limp. "He showed me a scar on his left leg and told me he had been discharged from the RAF because of the injury." "That is not Percy Baker," Doherty exclaimed. "Percy's nearer to our age. He's in his early 40s. Libman agreed it was indeed suspicious, as it implied that someone was going around impersonating Percy Baker. "And selling his furniture," Buckley cut in. "I think we'd better call the police," he said, picking up the telephone. Detective Constable Turner was dispatched to the shop and took statements from the 3 men, starting with Philip Libman. He told the officer that the man claiming to be Mr Baker had called into the shop on Thursday afternoon, the 22nd of May. Libman said he had accompanied the man to Manor House Farm and he had opened the door with the key. He asked me for £400 for the contents, but when he came into the shop on the following day, we settled on £300. Libman said that they had then returned to the house to make a full inventory. Asked if he had noticed anything unusual, Libman said there were some rings and a watch in the upstairs bedroom, but Mr Baker said they belonged to his wife and she must have left them behind. They had, after all, just separated, so it did sound plausible, he told the officer. Libman said there was one strange thing, and that there was a dog locked in the shed throughout his visit, and when he asked why he didn't let it out, the man told him it would run off and he hadn't time to chase after it. Libman said that he had asked for some form of identification, that he had been shown an identity card with the name Percy Baker. I gave him a deposit of £100 and yesterday my assistant and I went to collect the furniture. Asked if they had brought all the furniture back, Libman said that most of the stuff had been brought back here, but at the man's request some personal items had been dropped off at a shop in nearby Upper Mill. We took about 10 suitcases and a linen box there. Soon after we got to Upper Mill, he rode up on a bicycle and unlocked the shop so we could unload the suitcases. I then gave him the balance of the money and told him someone had been asking after Mrs. Baker. I asked him if he knew her address, but he was evasive. I'm not telling you because this man you've been talking to is the cause of our separation. After the detective had taken statements from all three, they drove over to Manor House Farm, found the place was locked up and they were unable to gain entry. They then headed for Upper Mill, and as they travelled down the main Standege to Upper Mill Road, they spotted Percy Baker's car parked up. They tried to open it, but like the house, it had been securely locked up. They waited for a while, but there was no one around. Detective Constable Turner reported back to the station and an investigation was set up into the whereabouts of the Bakers. In the meantime, PC Crooks, stationed at Upper Mill, took Mr. Libman to find the shop where he had dropped off the suitcases. When they arrived at the premises, the constable said that he seemed to recall it was rented by a certain John Gartside. As the two men drove out of Upper Mill, they spotted Baker's car again on the forecourt of Central Garage. A man was standing in front of the car, and Libman identified him as the man claiming to be Baker. Libman and the constable approached, and the man looked up in the start as he was spoken to. "Excuse me, sir, are you the owner of this vehicle?" "Of course I am," he replied. "Will you tell me your name, sir?" Up to that moment, the man hadn't spotted Mr. Libman behind the officer, and he went pale as recognition flitted across his face. He managed to regain his composure and told the man his name was Percy Baker. PC Crooks was one of those rural police officers who made it his business to know everybody on his beat, and he knew the real identity of the man claiming to be Percy Baker. "I know you," he said slowly. "Your name is John Gartside." Despite protestations to the contrary, Gartside was taken into custody pending further inquiries. He continued to try and bluff his way out of the situation by stating that he had impersonated Mr. Baker at the man's request to speed up the deal with Mr. Libman. He also claimed that he had bought the car off Percy Baker on the previous Friday for £200 and bought the furniture for a similar amount a day or so later. He could show no receipts for these transactions, nor had he any evidence to back up these claims. Detective Chief Inspector Ernie Stubbs of the West Riding CID at Wakefield was called in to oversee the case, and after leaving instructions that Gartside should be held at Upper Mill, he summoned the assistance of Lewis Nichols, Director of the North East Forensic Science Lab at Wakefield, to join him at Manor House Farm. Nichols pointed to a number of stains on the walls and ceiling and suggested that someone appeared to have tried to wash something off them. "Looks like blood to me," he told the inspector. A further search of the house found more evidence that suggested someone had been killed here and that the killer had tried to cover his traces by cleaning up after him. As the two men painstakingly examined every inch of the farm, officers went to the Gartside house. 23-year-old John Gartside lived with his parents less than 300 yards away from Manor House Farm on the main Oldham to Huddersfield Road. He was their only son and had been invalided out of the RAF a year earlier. He had made his living buying and selling motor cars before taking over rent of the shop at Upper Mill. Looking out of Gartside's bedroom window, the officers could clearly see the baker's residence. Leading the search at Gartside's house, Detective Sergeant Bow found a suit that showed faint traces of what appeared to be blood, but more damning was a .38 Webley revolver taken from his bedside cabinet. Gartside was interviewed by Chief Inspector Stubbs that evening and continued with his story that he had purchased items off Mr. Baker. The interview was broken when a call came through that bloodstains found at the house were tested as human. Returning to interview Gartside, Stubbs told him that he now had proof a murder had been committed at Manor House Farm. Asked who had been murdered, detectives said either Mr. or Mrs. Baker. "What if it is both?" Gartside said coldly. Cautioned, he then made a rambling statement in which he claimed he had made a call to see Baker about buying the car when he was offered the chance to buy some bedroom furniture. He claimed that Mrs. Baker seemed to object to this, but he sensed they had been arguing before his arrival, and judging from a remark Baker made, his wife had been having an affair. He then said Baker had brought a loaded rifle and revolver downstairs, which he was going to show Gartside, and put them on the hall settee. Gartside said that Mrs. Baker had then come into the room in a rage and had picked up a poker intent on striking her husband with it. He then claimed that Baker picked up the gun and shot his wife dead. Gartside said he tried to wrestle the gun from him and it went off accidentally, hitting the older man in the head. I then panicked. He was making a great deal of noise, writhing about in agony, so I picked up the rifle and shot him twice to put him out of his misery. There was blood all over the place. Gartside continued with his fantastic story by stating that he had then put the bodies in a wheelbarrow and buried them on the moors to make it look like they had gone away. He realised the predicament he was in and felt sure no one would believe him if he told the truth. On the following day, the police officers searched the area where Gartside claimed to have buried Mr and Mrs Baker. At a place known as Brum Moor, 200 yards from Standege Cutting and half-mile from their home, they found the naked bodies of Percy and Alice Baker in a shallow grave. County pathologist Dr T.L. Sutherland carried out the post-mortem and found Percy Baker had been shot 3 times, twice in the head and once in the body. The calibre of bullets matched the .38 found in Gartside's bedroom. Mrs Baker had been shot once with a revolver, and judging from the burn marks on the flesh, the shot had been fired from just a few inches away. On Monday the 28th of July 1947, John Edward Gartside found himself before Mr Justice Pritchard at Leeds Assizes. His defence was handled by Mr G.I. Hinchcliffe KC, while Mr G.H.B. Stretfield KC led for the Crown. Although Gartside's story was incredible, he had such a plausible manner and self-assurance that it was felt by some of the detectives handling the investigation that he had a fair chance of convincing the jury he was innocent. However, Mr Stretfield had a strong case. He was able to pick away at the inconsistencies in Gartside's statement, and he showed through police reconstruction and witness statements that there was no sofa in the hall where Gartside claimed Baker had put the guns. Also discredited was the fact that Gartside had said Baker had been accidentally shot during a struggle. Forensic evidence found that it was impossible from the trajectory of the bullet for Baker to have been shot during a struggle as Gartside claimed. As both counsels set out their cases, it seemed clear what had actually happened on that night. Gartside, a petty criminal, dubbed a spiv and a wide boy by his counsel Mr Hinchcliffe, had kept an eye on the Baker's house, seemingly waiting for the opportunity to burgle the place. He had then broken the 10th Commandment, "Thou shalt not covet thy neighbour's goods." On the fateful night he had gone to the house carrying his guns, and during the course of a robbery he was disturbed. It was Mrs Baker who came into the house first. Confronted by the intruder, she began to shout for help. Gartside pulled out his gun and demanded she shut up. Instead of heeding his command, she became hysterical, and when he failed in his attempts to quiet her, he panicked and shot her dead. Having now moved into the big league as a killer, he then had no choice but to execute Percy Baker when he rushed into the house. The defence countered that this was a deliberate, premeditated crime, claiming it was incredible to believe that the prisoner would have carried a rifle in broad daylight and would have been foolish enough to sell the furniture to a dealer just a few miles away. Foolish or not, the crowd showed Gartside to be the callous killer he was by claiming that rather than panic, he coolly plotted a scheme of pretending the couple had separated and hatched a plan to pass himself off as Percy Baker. The guilty verdict, when it came after the 3-day trial, was the only one possible on the evidence presented, and Mr Justice Pritchard sentenced the prisoner to death in the manner prescribed by law. Gartside was taken to Armley Jail in Leeds to await execution, and letters sent out to Hangman Steve Wade and assistant Alex Riley. Unbeknown to the prison authorities, Riley, who had last participated in execution in the spring of 1946, had since uprooted his family and emigrated to Australia to run a grocery business in Sydney. When no reply was received from Riley, a call was then made to London-based assistant Henry Critchell to assist. This was to be the 4th execution at Leeds in 1947, the last being just a week earlier, while Gartside was being held in one of the condemned cells there. As the gallows had yet to be updated at Leeds, and the execution shed was still in the prison grounds, there had been no need to move Gartside on the morning of the execution, as any noise from the crash of the trapdoors could not be heard from inside the wing of the prison. There was no appeal, and at 9 o'clock on Thursday the 21st of August, Spiv and wide boy John Gartside walked calmly to the gallows. My name is Steve Fielding. Thank you for watching and listening to another episode in Tales from the Hangman's Record. Please like and share this video, and if you don't already, can you please subscribe to the channel to keep up with new content. Check out my website, stevefielding.com, where you can find information on all my books, links to other videos in this series, and also order copies of the 3-volume hardback book, The Hangman's Record, at a special discount price. On sale now is my latest book, Tales from the Hangman's Record, available as a paperback and Kindle download from Amazon. Also look out for 2 new podcasts, Tales from the Hangman's Record and Mostly Murder, available on Spotify and all popular platforms. Finally, please use the comments below for your thoughts on this video and suggestions for further episodes in this series.